Okay.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Just waiting for everybody to get in the room here. Give it another couple seconds. You can see the numbers going up at the bottom of the screen. It's so funny. You'd think it would be automatic. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Io Wright from PostFire. I am very pleased to be bringing this to you this evening. I am a person who lost my house. I also lost a second property in the Eaton fire, and soil contamination has been something that has been on my mind greatly, and everyone that I know who also lost a home's mind. So it's really wonderful to be able to get some real answers from somebody who really knows what they're talking about to give us a little bit of guidance. So our org is called PostFire. It is a centralized survivors network. What we offer is centralized expert information and access to resources. So when you sign up for PostFire, you fill out all of the things that you need. And as those resources become available, we'll contact you directly. We're trying to like bring down the noise and the misinformation and bring up the expertise. There is a closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on it, and you can also select what language you would like it to function in. Please put any questions that you have also at the bottom of your screen as a little thing that says QA. Put your questions in there, and if you see a question that you would like answered, just upvote it. Helps us weed out duplicates. The webinar with notes, the recording of this will be available after today's session on YouTube and on the Postfire website. It's postfirela.org/expert QA. You can also find all of our previous Q&As there. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Professor Seth John of USC. He's a professor of earth sciences. Professor, can you just please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for having me, Io, and the Postfire team. So I'm faculty at the University of Southern California at USC, and really I'm an oceanographer. So most of the work that we do in my lab is studying metals in the ocean. We do a lot of work. We're very excited now about nickel isotopes in the deep Pacific. So these very sort of, interesting to us, but more sort of abstract topics. But we have, this instrumentation to measure fire stuff. So that's been a direction the lab has taken over the last little bit. So I'm faculty at USC Ocean Sciences, but have recently gotten very involved in firework.
So I guess it's great that actually I'm like very dumb about this stuff because I think a lot of people are coming to this completely blind, and it's
Yeah.
baffling to us how to move and what to do in this situation. It's absolutely baffling to me that someone who studies the ocean would be helpful in studying the soil after a fire. But I did flunk every science class that I took. I think like the broadest overview of, you may know this already, but bear with me.
Mhm.
Most people who have had a structure that has partially or completely burned are in a situation now where we have to decide what to do about debris removal. Are we going to go with private
Yeah.
debris removal, or are we going to go with the Army Corps of Engineers? From what I understand from most large-scale wildfires in California heretofore, they have tested the soil pretty extensively. And what
Yep.
we're hearing now is that the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA are not testing the soil. What they're doing is they're taking 6 inches of topsoil. So then we all went through this washing machine of emotions where we heard, oh my God, they're taking 6 inches of topsoil or 6 inches of soil from our entire properties. And then we came to find out that it was only 6 inches of soil from the exact burn area. So literally where the house is. So
Mhm.
that then left everybody with this question of what about the rest of my soil? Is my ground going to be completely contaminated? What do I do with that? So that's kind of the base premise that we're coming to you with. Can you maybe speak to that in like a broader sense?
Yeah. So it's a challenging question for even us to answer, and we've got some preliminary data that sort of begins to lead the way here. Um, so the First, let me just tell you a little bit more about specifically the sorts of analyses that our lab does, because I think that sort of answers part of the question is that we are currently only measuring lead. And what we've found is that the lead concentrations in the area of Altadena where the structures burned is elevated. So it is higher than it is, for example, outside of of outside of the burned area. So we've actually been doing these drives where we'll start in Sierra Madre and stop about every half a mile and pick up dust from the side of the road. And we can bring that back to the lab. And then to get to your question about how does an oceanographer get involved in this, because we're very good at measuring metals in seawater, we have some instrumentation. You can ask me about X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy later, but this is what it is. It kind of looks like a little laser gun. And so we take this sort of, almost laser gun looking thing and we aim it at the samples. We pull the trigger. It shoots X-rays into the sample and then looks for the X-rays that are emitted. So at the end of that, what we have is what's the concentration of lead in the sample that we just analyzed, that we were sort of pointing the instrument at. Um, so, so we're actually at this point, very interested eventually in trying to look at VOCs and asbestos, but lead has been the one that we've been able to measure so far. And uh, and so that's what we've looked at is lead concentrations in Altadena compared to these outlying areas. And we do find higher levels of lead. The next question is how high? And that is where it gets sort of complicated. Um, let me give you two numbers. Let me give you three numbers to sort of start the conversation, and we'll maybe sort of narrow in from there. The levels that we're finding in Altadena are sort of maybe 200 or 300 ppm in the ash from burned structures. The safe level of lead is zero. Like lead is not actually a nutrient. And so ideally, you would have something close to zero lead. As of a couple years ago, the US EPA cutoff for safe soils was 1,600 ppm. So by that standard, you're sort of well under that threshold. Then in between those two numbers, there's a couple of different thresholds. The EPA used to have one standard for all residential properties at 1,600 or 1,600, another threshold at 400 ppm for play areas where children would be playing. And so by that threshold, the ash that we were collecting in Pasadena would sort of be safe for a children's play area. Um, as of last year, the EPA lowered that limit to 200 ppm for all residential areas. And so there you're at a level where what we're measuring in Altadena is sort of about at that level. And California sets a level of 80 ppm. So I know it's a lot of numbers to keep in mind, but that's sort of, I just want to give some sense of the fact that the numbers we're finding are elevated and they're sort of high enough that it's something we should certainly keep in mind and really want to have in mind during remediation. I've sort of said elevated but not alarming is maybe how I'm trying to frame it right now.
Can you explain to me in layman's terms? I know that
Yeah.
you are a scientist and we like to be exact with things, but
Yeah.
in practicality, when you
Mhm.
say we want to keep an eye on something, what I hear is I need to pull up all of my dirt to be safe, or what do I need to do? So, like in practicality,
Yeah.
what does keeping an eye on something actually mean? And when you say elevated levels of lead, like, would you
Right.
let your child play in it? Would you grow a fruit tree in it? Like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so I bring my children with me when we go sampling. And I do this because this is all sort of volunteer work. We're just doing this because we're members of the community. I have like friends of my sort of through my kids who are living in the area. We have friends who've lost their homes. So we're really interested in this from a very practical standpoint. Um, yeah, I let my older daughter come with and sweep up the dust as we're going through the areas. 400 ppm is lower than we find at USC, like on campus at many locations. So, um, for gardening, there's a lot of guidance that suggests that a level of like maybe 400 ppm is also fine for gardening. So what would I say? Like, what do you actually do if this is your property? I think that remediating the soil on the burned areas, absolutely. Like what the EPA is already doing, that makes a ton of sense. Um, if you're planning on gardening on your yard and you haven't tested for lead levels, I guess I would suggest that you test before you grow vegetables that you're going to eat. Something like fruit trees, I would probably worry less about because fruit trees have roots that are going way down. We just have, we're trying to get this data as quickly as we can and sort of all running in different directions at once, trying to get as much different data as we can to understand this. But one of the things we looked at recently was how do lead concentrations change as you go down in the soil? And it does seem as though the lead contamination that we've seen from the ash is really at the top layer of the soil, which is sort of what you would expect, right? That's where all the sort of ash was deposited.
Mm.
And the other sort of very important point to get out here right at the front is that lead contamination is very high if you're right within the burned areas. So if you're sort of looking up as you're sampling and seeing burned structures, you're likely to see elevated lead concentrations. If you're outside of that neighborhood at all, and if you're looking up and seeing unburned houses, even if you've had ash deposited on your property, we don't, it doesn't look like the lead concentrations are much higher.
What other than lead are the things that ideally we would be testing for and remediating?
Yeah, um so I think ideally you would also be looking at asbestos and PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, these sort of organic compounds that are formed during a fire.
Mm.
Um, I think I'd say from my perspective, lead is maybe one of the elements that's likely to be most persistent. So that's one that you'd really want to sort of have a handle on as you move forward. Um, I think there's less study about the volatile compounds, the VOCs. Asbestos is bad, of course, if you inhale it. So you might want to try and remediate the ash that's on the top of your property, even if it's at the edges. But really, that's only going to damage you if it gets in your lungs. So if you're able to sort of wash away or remove away that ash that deposited during the initial fire, it's as a scientist, I only want to say things that I'm certain about, and even me, like I'm sure many of the people who are on this call, like there's a lot of uncertainty, and so I can't tell you for sure that asbestos is not a problem, but my sense is that that would probably be less of a concern.
What can you just break down the process, like step by step, if people did want to remediate or remove soil from like their entire property? What would be like the absolute safest way that someone could go about this? Is it like scraping how many inches? Is 6 inches from the burn area actually sufficient, or is the army just kind of covering its ass? Like, what are we working with here?
Yeah, so again, it's like I can't tell you that 6 inches is going to be fine, full stop, you're done. But my sense is that 6 inches really is quite a bit of soil off the top of this, right? Like when we go out to the, yeah, right? Like, and we go out to these properties and like that top layer absolutely has some elevated levels. Again, elevated, not alarming, but like
Hmm.
there are higher levels of lead and presumably also higher levels of other contaminants in that ash layer at the very top. But we measured a homeowner's yard recently who was just outside of the burn area. And in the very top inch of soil, you did see higher levels of lead that could have been from, she had one of the homes that was preserved, but it was right
Hmm.
next to a bunch of neighbors that were burned down. And in the very upper level of the soil, we did see some evidence of that contamination. But as we got down even 1 or 2 inches, it was greatly diminished.
What is the best way for people to test for these things? Like, is there something that we could do on our own, or do we have to hire somebody? If we're going to hire somebody, who are we hiring? Do they need a certain licensure?
Yeah. Um, So I think if you're hiring like an EPA certified, like a state certified contractor, of course, they're doing the sort of full testing level. That's also expensive. And that's a lot to ask of people, right? To sort of do that full level of testing. Um, I think that, uh, I think you could. Well, okay. So one of the things we're really trying to spin up here at USC is allowing members of the community to submit soil samples for us to analyze for lead. And now lead isn't everything you'd be worried about, but it is a really good starting point for trying to understand, is my soil sort of greatly impacted by the fire or not impacted by the fire? Um, I'm a little hesitant to say that just because, we're really sort of spinning this up without funding, just trying to figure out, how we can get the grad students to get in the lab and process these samples. But we think it's really important work to do. Um, so that may be one option that homeowners have in order to get at least a lead concentration from some soil samples on their property. Um, and I think that, that 6 inch rule really does, that to me does feel safe, right? Like if it were my home, if we were removing 6 inches, well, okay, so if we were removing 6 inches off the burned area and then building back a house on that location, I'd feel totally confident, right? Like you're putting a house down, it's got a concrete foundation, it's got floors. You're not going to be resuspending any of that soil or dust up to you. I've just heard about the fact that they're not going to be remediating the nearby properties. And how do I feel about that? I think, I really think it could be okay, but I think you might, if you've really had a lot of burning and a lot of ash deposition right on your property, you might want to remove the top bit of soil, at least try and get that highly contaminated ash off your soil. I don't know. I feel like that's sort of it's an unclear answer, but it's an unclear answer because it's an unclear situation.
Sure. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing you say is 6 inches from the actual burn area itself, where it's going to be covered over. Bear in mind that most of Altadena does not have concrete foundations. We mostly have raised foundations, but it still will have flooring over it and it'll have, all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Um, but then I'm hearing you say that it would be safest to do some degree of remediation on the rest of the soil on the property if you're going to grow things in it.
Yeah, that seems totally right to me. Like if you're coming back to a like a burned down property, first of all, I really feel for you. We have friends who've gone through this. But if you're sort of at a burned out property and you've got the remnants of like that full urban burn that's just been deposited on your garden, I would take out that soil. I would like replace that. I would, dig it out down to where it gets, we have a lot of granite in California. So if you dig down deep enough, you'll get to that sort of rocky, sandy base soil. Maybe put in raised beds and bring in new soil. I think there's a lot of things you could do if you're going to be gardening in the soil. I would, and this is just me, right? Like,
That's what we want to know.
according to the University of Maryland, 400 ppm is fine. And honestly, the concentrations we've been finding are below 400 ppm. So, you could find levels out there that would say you're just good to go as is.
Hmm.
If I were in that position and I were like cutting up those tomatoes for my kids at night, yeah, I'd like get new soil for sure. So I think that some amount of like really trying to mitigate the most extreme exposure to that stuff makes total sense to me.
Is there any form of, is removing soil the only form of remediation that would make that really actually truly safe?
Yeah, okay. Well, now I'll give you a real scientist answer, which
Great.
is that Aaron Celestian at the Natural History Museum has been working with zeolites, which are these crazy minerals which can absorb lead inside them. And so you can spread these sort of like, they're like these porous minerals, and you can spread them out on soil and they like suck up the lead. And then once the lead is in the mineral, it never comes out again. It like just locks it away forever. So it's this really interesting, uh, potential way to like permanently remediate your soils.
Hmm.
So you asked me like, is there any way? Like, yeah, there's sort of, there are these other potential ways that you could remediate the soils for lead. Um, is that the easiest way? Probably not. Like the easiest way is definitely just to take away the ash and the other sort of burned material.
And how deep are we talking? Not in the actual burn area, but like on the rest of the property. How deep do we need to take?
Yeah, I would certainly try and remove that top layer that has the burned ash in it. Um, we have very little data on this, so it's hard for me to give you like a clear answer. Um,
Think of your kids' tomatoes again.
like kids' tomatoes, right? If we lead is not a mobile element. And so, in neither is asbestos, and honestly, neither are these PAHs, the aromatics. So, what you want is you don't want your kids to be inhaling like fine particulates that have sort of been kicked up um, by playing in the dirt and have that come up and they just sort of inadvertently breathe a little bit of that. So that's what you're trying to avoid. So what do? If it's like a concrete driveway, really you just like spray it off with a hose and most of that is going to go away. Um, if you have a sandbox that your kid has, I don't know, sand is cheap. I'd like go out, I'd just like replace the whole sandbox, right? Like the kids are going to be playing in it. Um, if you're putting down a yard with turf, I would lay down a full layer of new turf over the top. But anything that you do that's fully sort of sealing away that any potentially contaminated soil down below should reduce your exposure. I'm a scientist, so I can't say entirely, but it's really going to basically, if you're on sort of any of those surfaces, you're really just not going to be exposed to the fire
I
material.
think the concern is because in much of Altadena, at least, a lot of the appeal of living there is having some degree of outdoor life.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have vegetable gardens, and a lot of people have big backyards and dogs that dig in dirt and things like
Yeah.
that. So, like, are we talking the best thing would be to take 3 inches or just the top inch? Like, at what point is it going to be not terrifying if our dogs are in the backyard digging a hole?
Okay, so I just keep trying to put myself in your situation, right? What would I thought about living in Altadena. It's beautiful out there. I've spent a lot of time hiking in the mountains. We have friends who lived out there. It's really, really nice. What would I do? Um, Yeah, a couple inches. 3 inches sounds pretty good to me, right? Like, I don't think any of the ash is going to have penetrated down further than that. That's a lot of material that you're taking off the top.
Mhm.
Honestly, like I sort of, as a scientist, what I would say is, just like spray off the top with a hose and you're probably fine. But then as a parent, I'm like, well, yeah, but like probably fine isn't good enough for me, right? I really want to sort of do something better than that. But by time you get down a couple of inches, I really think that, the ash that was there is not going to have made its way down over inches down in your property over the course of a couple of weeks.
Mhm.
And so I think something
Um,
like that feels
How
like,
far outside of the immediate burn zone would you recommend, just in terms of the way that air particles and ash has traveled, which has obviously traveled quite far?
yeah.
How far do you recommend that people remove some of their topsoil?
Yeah, again, it's really hard to sort of provide a a number here, right? Like what would I feel comfortable with? We live in Los Feliz, so we smelled smoke. I had ash on my car. I'm definitely not replacing the soil out here. I feel like we were plenty far away from it. Um, if you go to uh, the I think you guys will hopefully share a link to the USC Public Exchange website where we've started to publish data on what we're seeing in the roadside dust. And I'd sort of come back to that. If you look at where we're seeing the elevated lead concentrations, it's right in the area where you just have burn structures that were painted with lead paint, and of course, you burn that, and that ash is going to contain lead, and it does. And we measure that when it comes down into the street. But when you get just a block or two out of those burned areas, it really seems like the lead concentrations in dust go back to essentially background levels.
Okay, that's very helpful to know. So we're really talking about the people who are inside of the burn zone or have a burn next to their property.
Yeah.
Someone's asking, will these toxins remain in the soil for 10 plus years or forever since some don't break down, or does the rain really wash them away, which of course means into our streams and rivers and oceans?
Yeah. So the answer is a little bit different depending on which of the toxins you're talking about. Um, so Uh, let's see. So but it's sort of there's a little bit sort of good news on either side. So let me talk first about, let me bring up a new one that I haven't talked about, which is arsenic. So we also find elevated arsenic in the region of the burned structures. And so I went out with my daughter and we collected water in little Ziploc baggies as we sort of went along. And there's elevated arsenic in the rainwater that was right in Altadena after that first rain. Why is that? It's because arsenic is used. It's a long answer to a short question, but I'll get there. Arsenic is used to prevent wood rot. And so a lot of the timber that would have been used in construction had arsenic in it, and then you burn it. Arsenic is also a very mobile element, so it's really easily dissolves in water.
Mm.
So what that means is that we saw ars I wouldn't say a lot of arsenic. It was actually fully below any EPA thresholds for action, but it was higher in Altadena than it was in the other areas. So we saw these sort of elevated levels of arsenic. So that's the bad news, is that you do really see it in the water. The good news is that it will wash away. So any of those mobile elements like that will wash away with the rain. We also tested the Los Angeles River. So that was sort of an area that was getting not just Altadena, but sort of all of Los Angeles. And what we found there is that we couldn't see any notable elevation of arsenic there. So what that means is that, like, yeah, there was a little bit of extra arsenic coming out of the Altadena burn area, but it wasn't enough to impact the whole Los Angeles basin. You couldn't really see it, which then is also good news for the oceans, right? That means that the levels of these toxins that are leaching out into the oceans they're there. Like there will be some amount, but it's probably uh, not super high compared to what's already in the oceans compared to the other things that are going in. Um, so that's a mobile element. And for a mobile element like that, it really will wash away from your property over time. I would contrast that to something like lead or arsenic, which are immobile. Sorry,
Asbestos, you mean?
sorry, sorry, lead or asbestos. I started with the A and just went. So lead and asbestos are relatively immobile. So those don't wash away from your property as easily. So
Mm.
if you have asbestos from the fire or lead from the fire, which is in the ash, and it's gotten down several inches below the level at which you're removing soil, it's gonna stay there. Like it will just be there for the long term. Um, the good news for those mobile elements is that they're not sort of continually washing out into your property. So that's where the strategy of sort of removing the top level of soil and then putting down a new layer on top of it um, is the strategy to sort of protect yourself from that.
Understood. Okay, so just to recap, what I'm hearing is it would be safest and wisest to remove 3 inches of soil from the entire property in addition to the 6 inches on the actual burn zone. And then importantly, to replace that with fresh new soil.
Yes, absolutely. It's almost less about the removing of the burn soil than it is about sort of capping it, putting something on top of it. It just means that when like you go out to play, when your kids are out playing, that you're sort of getting new sod or something rather than this old material.
Um, how do plants metabolize the contaminants present in our soil? Like, will they present a danger to us ongoing? I know you mentioned the roots of the trees, but like more generally.
Yeah, so there, if you grow plants in soils that have a lot of heavy metals, they will take some of that up into them. Um, we've tested for levels of cadmium and they seem very low. Arsenic is not something that's particularly sort of mobile for uptake by plants. So yeah, this is something I know less about.
Mm.
But my from the I've sort of from the small amount of research I've done, it really seems as though the amount of lead that gets from the soils up into the actual sort of vegetable matter, like the tomato that you're eating, the orange that you're picking from your tree, really isn't that high. Um, so, again, like in a perfect world, like some soil testing for sure might be useful. But my expectation would be that like eating oranges from your tree would be just fine.
Okay. Um, Somebody asked a great question, which is since you're mostly testing lead, is there a reason to believe that other contaminants are correlated with lead levels? So like high lead equals high asbestos. Is that kind of the idea with lead?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're thinking. And I have a grad student who's planning to go over to the Natural History Museum and measure asbestos in order to answer exactly this question. So, as a scientist, I'm trying to get the data that will really allow us to establish that this is true, that lead really is correlated with asbestos. But that's 100% our assumption based on what we're seeing is that we go into these sort of urban burns, we see the high lead that must be correlated with the other sort of urban burn contaminants.
Appreciate you not using fancy $4 words for my simple mind. Um, in terms of people's options for testing,
Mhm.
what are not super, when you say that it's expensive, what is that like ballpark? What does that mean? And what are ways to do that testing that might not be so expensive that people can at least have like some real concrete answers on these other materials as well?
Yeah, so uh we're sort of we're not we don't know that much about the commercially available alternatives, but we've certainly heard from people who are in the burn areas that that's an expensive option. Um, as I said, we're a little worried. We're just going to be overwhelmed with thousands of soil samples, which would be both difficult for us because we need to find a whole lot of people to sit in the lab and like process these samples and analyze them, but also I think a real service to the community. So we're sort of, on both sides of this, but this is one of the things that we're trying to provide is a low cost or no cost way of getting just sort of not certified testing, not all the answers about every contaminant in your soil, but a way of just sort of getting a first pass look. Like, does my soil look totally fine? Or is there lead in there? Is there a lot of lead in there? Well, if there's a lot of lead in there, then you really might worry about the other contaminants as well.
What is the testing called that someone should seek out if they want to do commercial soil testing for all of these contaminants?
I, I'm
Don't even know.
fully outside the area of my expertise.
I
Yeah.
appreciate, and that's outside my scope answer. We will find out and we will post that information. Um, Somebody's asking a question that I had too. It sounds like the results that you're seeing are very different from what they found in the campfire, where post-remediation testing found that about a third of properties needed additional rounds of soil removal after the first 6 inches. So what do we make of that? Because that's something I'm hearing too, is that there were like several rounds because they would test and test and test and test. And I'm also curious what you think about the decision not to test here and why, given that it's the largest fire of its type.
All right. So yeah, now we've fully entered the area, which is, I'm sort of a scientist. I can measure the lead, so I'll try and speak to this, but I'm not an expert and, I don't have any more insight than you do or anybody on the call as to why this decision was made. Um, and I really I haven't done a lot of the background research on the campfire, so I can't quite answer that question either. Um, the thing that I can tell you that I think bears on this is that lead in particular is a pervasive contaminant in urban environments. And so actually, even if there hadn't been a fire, if you were to go out to a bunch of properties anywhere in Los Angeles, you would expect that as you dig down in the soil, you see high lead concentrations. We were driving cars with leaded gasoline for many decades. It was really massive amounts. This was before we understood the toxic potential of lead. Um, so there were huge amounts of lead that was emitted to the urban environments from gasoline, from the previous use of lead paint. And so anywhere you go in an urban environment, and there's some amount of I told you before that the safest level of lead is zero, but you're never going to find that. Any natural environment will have some amount of lead in it. And so my I think my sort of sense of it is that what may be happening is that they're worried that as they get deeper down into the soil, you just sort of keep finding lead because there's just lead in urban environments, and it may not be related to the
Mm.
um, fire necessarily. And so again, I think that one of the big things to keep in mind with the soil removal strategy is that it's partly about removing that top level of soil, removing the contaminants as part of it. But it's exactly what you said, Io, that it's that and then capping it over so that you're not exposed to it. So if there's lead, it, I'm sort of looking down at my floor, like as a geologist, somewhere down there, there's a lot of lead, right? Like there's just like a lot of naturally occurring lead. Living in Los Angeles, there's contaminant lead at some level down there. But really, what we need to be concerned about is exposure. So if we're exposing people to that dust that's getting in our lungs, that's the real concern. Lead being on your property is um, just something that happens.
I guess this lends itself to a question that is a little bit broader about living in these areas and re-inhabiting these areas.
Yeah,
Um, because again, Palisades, Altadena, these are areas where people like to be outside, and that's part of why they live there. And we have beautiful parks that have been decimated, but will hopefully rebuild. And they will probably not have the same type of soil removal done that we would all maybe do at our own properties or remediation in the way we'd like.
yeah.
Somebody's asking a question here about whether or not, like, can I walk the dog in front of my house, Palisades Park, without thinking that I'm exposing him to fire toxins? I have the same question for Altadena. Like, will it ever be safe to just like be out with an animal or a small child in areas that are not completely under our control? Or is this going to be like a longer term health nightmare in these areas?
Yeah, so I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, right? Like, what would I do if I lived in Altadena? What would I recommend that my friends who do live in Altadena do? Um,
I mean, think of it this way, right? Let me just put more of a point on it.
oh,
If in uh Altadena you've got, I think it was 5,800 structures burned, maybe 9,000, and I'm getting my numbers wrong, but let's say it's 5,800 structures just in this one concentrated area.
right.
Obviously, with 80-mile-an-hour winds that ignited that, everything's blowing around. There's no, oh, my structure burned, and so all of the toxic things are just right here.
Yeah.
So then you've got a park a block from my house, for example, or a block from this person's house. I would imagine their soil would be just as bad as my front yard.
Yeah, but remember the dust that we're the, sort of this, we're in front of people's houses. This dust has elevated levels of lead, but it's not, it's really not sort of exceeding these sort of like highest action levels. We can go around USC campus and pull up dirt that has as much lead in it as the ash right in front of people's properties. So I can't tell you it's totally safe, right? Like the optimal level is zero. But you go to a park, there's been some rain, you're walking, your dog like sort of runs back and forth. I would feel comfortable taking my dog out to go like fetch the two dogs actually, but I'd feel comfortable taking them out to a local park. Maybe not, sort of like not today, but like after the remediation efforts have taken place, after there've been a couple rains to wash away that top level of contamination. Yeah, I would.
Okay. So for the folks whose houses are still standing, who are gonna like do a bunch of remediation and get back into their houses, it sounds like the recommendation is like, don't take the dog out to dig in the dirt for maybe a while. Like give it a couple months, give it a year kind of thing.
That feels right to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Someone has asked a question, will vegetables, trees, and plants we grow in the soil of standing houses next to slash near slash downwind from burned areas uptake toxins from the burned homes?
Right, sort of the like living trees that have just been exposed to all this ash through their leaves and stuff. Um, yeah, so it'll be sort of my answer for everything is probably a little bit, right? Like, some small amount. But again, I think the trees will probably the amount of these toxins that we're seeing in the ash are not high enough that I think this sort of, the whole tree will be contaminated, especially after a rain in just a little while to recover.
Okay, the right after this happened, there was this like prevailing narrative, especially around air toxins, that there was no safe distance. And so asbestos would travel anytime the wind blows. And I believe that that's still accurate from what I understand until the debris sites are cleared. But
Mhm.
I'm kind of hearing from this conversation is uh, there are elevated levels of lead, but the best idea would be to do some testing of your own and to remove an extra couple inches of soil from areas where a home, like on a property where a home has burned. But you don't need to panic about going to the park with your dog as long as it's not in the immediate. You have to wait 6, 8, 12 months after there are some rains, and then it would probably be safer. Just to like kind of recap, correct?
Yeah, that feels right. Like, I don't know, I might take my dog out sooner than 6 months from now, especially if it was a park that, if you're right in that burned area, I would give it some time until the remediation efforts have really concluded.
Mm,
Um, but if you're outside the burn area at all, there was some amount of lead in the ash that deposited all over Los Angeles. There's some amount of these toxins that were everywhere. That's right. But, and it's hard to say in the face of that, like I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish and say there's no problem, right? Like if you have these toxins that we really were all exposed to during this fire. But the levels are pretty low. As long as you're really sort of outside of the immediate burn area, the rains really made me feel a lot better. Like really feel like, that sort of mobile stuff, that dust, which could very easily be kicked up, had really been mitigated by that.
mm.
Um, yeah.
Okay. Um, Question from the audience is, do mudslides like the ones we just recently had affect the distribution of lead or other contaminants throughout the community?
Yeah, so I have colleagues at USC who really are sort of much more focused on the landslide question.
I hope that wasn't a Freudian slip. The lead slides.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure it out. Sort of as a geologist, I just go back to trying to think about like these different materials, right? Like you've got this ash on top, and that's what's really holding these contaminants. And then underneath that is just the natural soil. So that natural soil, mudslides are a real like safety hazard on their own. Like they're really, something you really have to worry about in areas after a fire. They become much more prone to these mudslides. In terms of contamination, I think probably not. That's just sort of natural soil that's being exposed.
Okay, helpful. Somebody is saying that so all the grass, flowers, and bushes basically have to be removed. I have dogs that like to eat leaves and grass, etc. Is that accurate? Things that are already there have to go to avoid contamination that has come from this for the specifically animals that would eat it.
Yeah, it depends a lot on exactly where you are, right? Like if you're in the burn structure area of Altadena, like I would not let your dogs eat that material. Um, if it's been a light dusting of ash, like if you're, sort of a quarter
Hmm.
mile outside of the area post rains, I think you'd probably be okay.
Very clear, very helpful.
But it's hard
Somebody
to
was
know, right? Oh, I struggle with all these questions in the same way that I'm sure everybody on this call struggles with these questions, right? Like how close is close? How much is a lot?
And there's no one size fits all answer for everybody. I mean, some people have one house, four houses on a block. Some people have 40 houses on a block, which lends itself to a question that I saw fly past earlier, which is, what if my neighbor, basically, what if your neighbors aren't taking the same precautions as you are and they have it in their yard? Is it something that, like, in a best case scenario, because there's like a block captain system that's been going on where people have become block captains of their area and they're communicating with all of their neighbors? Is the ideal to try to wrangle all of your neighbors into the same thing? Sounds like it, right? Like remove the same amount of soil. But if somebody doesn't and somebody's not interested in participating in that, is it like we gotta avoid the neighbor's yard with the dog?
Yeah, if you have neighbors who are building back on a fully burned lot that was covered in ash and they're not remediating the front yard, I wouldn't let your dog play on that yard. Like I would sort of I would take some level of caution with this. I wouldn't sort of do nothing and say that whatever you do, it's going to be okay. Um, but I also think if your neighbor doesn't remediate their yard and you did remediate your yard, your dog can probably play on your yard, right?
Okay.
Like not going to be kicking up anything from your yard that's from your neighbor.
Yeah. I mean, it's what's also coming to mind for me is the fact that like now we're gonna have with this many burned structures, once people rebuild and then people start reselling their properties, you're gonna have properties where people are gonna want to know if you took the soil or if you didn't, and it's probably gonna have something to do with resale value of your house, etc. Um, Somebody is saying, do we need to worry about lead seeping into the groundwater or anything else?
Um, so we also measured elevated lead in the rainwater that we were collecting. So when I say this, what we were doing is this was the very first rain right after the fires, and we were going along and collecting water that was sort of sitting basically stagnant on top of this ash.
Mm,
And even in that water, the lead concentrations were below the EPA thresholds for safety.
mm,
So again, it was elevated. It was higher there than it was outside of the burned area, but it was not at a super alarming level. Um, so some amount of lead is going to leach down into the groundwater, but uh, yeah, I think maybe not especially high levels.
okay. I just quickly want to touch on safety for people whose houses didn't burn, who've just been contaminated, who are doing more
Yeah.
remediation that way. Do you have like kind of some broad strokes recommendations for those folks?
Can I say no?
Yes,
You know,
absolutely.
yeah, like we're sort of really doing the best we can to try and answer. You hear me just answering all these sort of scientific questions based on the data that we have. Um,
Sure.
my sense is that the people who are sort of dealing with this first person have a better sense of exactly what's being recommended for remediation
Mhm.
outside the burned area.
Fair. Um, is there any published research on this topic from other recent California fires or the Colorado Marshall Fire that you know of where people can go and kind of dig into this a little deeper?
Yeah, there's not much work done on this. And so that's one of the reasons that we've really been trying to step in and, head out on weekends, like trying to collect these samples so that we have data in order to address this.
Mm,
Um, there's a couple of papers after the Marshall Fire that looked at these issues. There's maybe a handful of papers about lead contamination in Los Angeles more broadly. So
mm,
there was an Exide battery plant in Downey that was doing recycling of lead acid car batteries. And in that area, there's a lot of properties that are contaminated with really quite high levels of lead, much higher than anything that we've seen in Altadena.
mm,
Some of that is probably a result of the proximity being next to this battery recycling plant. Some of
mm,
that is just natural lead contamination in urban environments, like the gasoline, right? The amount of leaded gasoline that was burned in Los Angeles was very high. Yeah.
All right. Well, as we're coming to a close, the last question I'm going to go to here is how deep of a capping is recommended if we don't remove? And is something like wood chips or mulch okay or too porous?
Yeah, I think what I would the sort of the image I keep going back to is trying to imagine like the activities in your yard. And then I've actually got sort of up here in the background because I brought it up earlier, a picture of one of the burned properties. And so you look out at this property and you see all of this black ash. I wouldn't want that black ash from the urban burn to be kicked up as dust and then to be breathing it in. I wouldn't want my kids to be breathing it in. Pregnant women are at particular risk. I sort of really wouldn't want you know, somebody pregnant to be breathing in that ash from the burn.
Mm,
So from there, you sort of go to trying to figure out like, well, what's the right amount of capping? I guess I would say just putting wood chips down feels to me like probably not enough, right? Like as you walk around on the wood chips, that's just gonna mix in with the ash below, and you can easily sort of imagine a couple years from now, you're out there kicking around, and that ash will resuspend back up.
mm,
Um, if you've laid down a couple inches of soil, or if you've put new grass on the top, or laid down some soil and put down some rock, then I do the same imaginative process. Well, what if there were like a little bit of ash under that? I mean, really, I don't think you're going to be exposed to that. So I'm sort of just trying to solve this question by those sorts of processes, really just sort of imagining what the potential routes of exposure might
mm.
be.
Um, all right. Well, I'm gonna just share that somebody in the chat has said, in case it's helpful to anyone, I sent my soil sample to alluvial soil lab. It's the heavy metals test covering lead, cadmium, chromium, and arsenic, and it costs $185. That's ALLUVIAL soil lab. So that's something that we can explore. Postfire is going to go do some research on the different soil testing options that are available. We're going to post some information about that. But in broad strokes, takeaway from this conversation today, the safest practice is to remove about 2 to 3 inches of soil beyond just what the Army Corps of Engineers is going to do, which is 6 inches in your actual burn zone. There are some laws that have passed in California that are relevant to this process around how the Army slash the county, not the Army, how the county is going to be billing people for this quote unquote free debris removal program. So if you have insurance, from what I understand, and again, we will do some research on this and I will confirm this 100%, but from what I understand currently, the Army you can do whatever other remediation efforts you need to do before the Army does their billing, and whatever is left, if anything is left, is what the county will bill on behalf of the Army for their remediation program versus most fires in the past where they just come in and they clear out what's available in your insurance money. So if you are watching this, we will get more information on exactly what's going to happen with that billing process because from what I'm hearing in this conversation, what I would like to go do is do some testing, hire a private soil removal, debris removal company to take my driveway and the stuff that the Army is not taking and that extra bit of soil, and then let the Army have my money. So we will follow up with all of this. This conversation is being recorded. It will be uploaded with closed captions and Spanish translation to our YouTube and to postfirela.org/expert QA. If you have expert Q&As that you would like to have in the future or things that you would like to have answered, just let us know on that same website. Also on postfirela.org is our survivors network. So if you need information or you need resources, you can make requests there. You can also like make your voice heard on things that are really important to you. Like for example, we're going to send out some type of poll or vote on whether people would like the county to revisit their decision to only do 6 inches of topsoil here, I would imagine. Thank you so much, Professor John. It's been a real pleasure to have somebody calm on here to talk to us about this stuff with some facts. And I do appreciate you saying when you didn't know. I appreciate that a lot. So
Great.
thank you for your time this evening.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It was great to chat with you.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone has a decent night.